Good evening, everyone. Earlier this past summer, I was driving through my old neighborhood. At the time, the World Cup soccer games were going on over in Europe, over in Germany. And I got to thinking about those 12 seasons that I coached soccer for the YMCA in that old neighborhood so many, many years ago. And I wondered if those old soccer fields were still there. So I detoured off and I went in search. And sure enough, they were still there. I parked my car and got out, looked around. There wasn't another soul in sight, just me and those old soccer fields. Now there was one field in particular I wanted to visit. So I left the car and I walked out onto that empty field. The soccer goals were still standing proudly at each end. And with that, I began to reflect. In my mind, I could go back 30 years. It was the first night of practice for what turned out to be my last season as a soccer coach. The YMCA had sent me a fine group of young boys, ages 10 and 11, and the name of our team would be the Buccaneers. Well, by the end of the first practice, I could tell, as a coach, I was in for a bit of a challenge. Not exactly overloaded with talent. Some of the boys had not even played the sport before. But you know, winning is a lot more fun than losing. No question about that. Any coach worth his salt teaches his team to play fair, but play to win. After coaching so many seasons with teams that finish near the top, near the bottom, and all in between, you come to a realization. Yes, you do want to win, but the true measure of a coach falls at a much higher level. At least for me and most of my fellow coaches, it was to embrace the YMCA philosophy and its motto, to develop the mind, body, and spirit of these fine young boys, to get to know each of them individually, to learn what their abilities are, their level of skill, and then decide as a coach what you can do to develop them as individuals and as a team. Well, the season got underway. The weeks passed, the games were played, and, well, the losses were mounting. But you know, there was something so unique about this team. Unlike any team I'd ever coached before, these boys come back each week just as fired up and just as enthusiastic as they were on that very first night of practice. It was almost like they were saying, "Don't give up on us, coach. We want to play. We want to learn." So I just did the best I could. We worked with the boys. My assistant coach and I decided that we were going to pull out all the stops. We were going to throw everything we had into working with these boys. And I'll tell you this, they were getting better each week. They were improving. But as far as winning games, it would be a long season. And now we're down to our final game of the season. And as luck would have it, our final game would be against the mighty, the dreaded Cougars. Now don't get me wrong, this was a well-coached, fine group of boys too, but they were very, very good. They had simply dominated the league the entire season. Few teams had even scored a goal on them. For the Buccaneers, this would be their greatest challenge. So now it's Thursday evening, the last night of practice before that final game on Saturday. And as the practice wore on, I could tell, for the first time, the Buccaneers were down. Their spirits were low. Their enthusiasm all but gone. Now, for a coach, that's a very painful moment in time. You want to do something to give them a lift, boost their morale, make them feel better. So I thought about it for a few minutes. And then I decided I was going to do something that I had never done before as a coach. Now, this would be uncharted territory, but I wanted to give it a shot. I blew my whistle. I had the boys come up around me, and I said, fellas, tonight, instead of doing our normal end of practice drills, I want to tell you a story. I quickly looked into their faces to get their reaction. Well, they grew quiet, and their eyes grew wide. Now that told me right there, they were hungry for something. They were hungry for anything that would give them that lift to boost their morale, make them feel better. A few weeks earlier, I'd been driving to work one morning, and the radio announcer was talking about this book that was required reading for all new FBI agents. Well, that piqued my interest, and I listened carefully. Well, the book was about the pursuit of excellence. No surprise there. What was a surprise was that the main character in that book was a seagull, an ocean seagull. Now, many of you may be familiar with this book. Its author is Richard Bach, and the name of the book, Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Well, I got that book and I read it, and there was one part of that book I thought might connect with these boys. So I proceeded to tell the story. There was this flock of seagulls that lived down by the ocean. They spent their days flying in search of food. They flew behind the shrimp boats and out by the pier, wherever they could scavenge for food. The only reason they flew was to eat. But out over the ocean, way out beyond the shore and beyond the boats, was one lone seagull. His name was Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and he was no ordinary bird. Jonathan was always taking flight. He loved to fly. The other seagulls only flew to eat, but for Jonathan, it was just the opposite. He only ate so that he could fly. He wanted to master flight, and he had come a long way. He had already mastered many of the complicated maneuvers, the twists and the turns. But on this beautiful afternoon, the subject was speed. Jonathan wanted to fly fast. He wanted to fly very fast, faster than any seagull had ever flown before. So in the story, Jonathan flies up to 1,000 feet and goes into a steep dive. He extends his wings out all the way and holds them as rigid as he can. 50 miles an hour, 70 miles an hour, his wings are beginning to vibrate a bit, but at 90 miles an hour, his wings will not hold. He goes into a violent tumble and crashes into the sea. Well, now, Jonathan wasn't the kind of bird that gives up easily. So out of the water he came, back up to 1,000 feet, and tried again. But the results were the same. At 90 miles an hour, his wings wouldn't hold. He went into another violent tumble and fell into the sea. He kept trying over and over again. And finally, after crashing into the ocean one more time, he was exhausted. As he lay there floating on the water, he realized something. It was dark. The moon was already out. Seagulls don't fly in the dark. So he pulled himself out the water, his weary little body, and started flying back toward the lights on the shore. For the first time in his life, Jonathan was filled with self-doubt. He was discouraged. And as he flew along, he started talking to himself. If I was supposed to fly in the dark, well, I would have the eyes of an owl. And if I was meant to fly very, very fast, well, I would have the short wings of a falcon. And there in the darkness, 100 feet above the ocean, Jonathan blinked his eyes. The short wings of a falcon. He had an idea. Well, the next morning at the crack of dawn, he's back out over the ocean again. And in the story, he flies to 5,000 feet and prepares to go into his dive. But this time, instead of extending his wings out rigid like before, he folds them in close to his body so that he would fly on these edges, sort of like the short wings of a falcon. 70 miles an hour, 90 miles an hour, he still had perfect control. 120, 150, 180, and finally, terminal velocity, 214 miles an hour. And as Jonathan powered out of that dive and began to slow down, he realized he had just made seagull history. He had flown faster than any seagull had ever flown before. I looked at my little guys and I said, what that story teaches us is that you never really know how much you can achieve, how much you can accomplish, unless you keep trying. And sometimes you have to reach deep. I studied the boys' faces again to get their reaction. Well, their eyes were even wider than before. I think they liked the story. It seemed to connect. In fact, a few of the boys lingered after practice asking questions. They wanted to know more about the little seagull. But now it's Saturday, the day of the final game. A perfectly beautiful fall, cool, crisp day, blue sky. And out on the field are the dreaded Cougars doing their pregame exercises, warm-ups, looking as intimidating as ever. I gathered my little Buccaneers around me, and we talked about assignments, strategy, and then a bit of a pep talk, but now it's time to play. Out on the field they went, the referee blew his whistle, and the game began. Within seconds, the Cougars had taken control of the ball. They're coming down the field. They're charging for what looks like a sure goal. But at the last second, one of the Buccaneer defenders stepped up. He wrested that ball away and passed it to another Buccaneer over near the right sideline. That Buccaneer took the pass and charged down the field deep into the Cougar territory, where he gave the ball a good boot toward the goal. Well, now the ball is in the air. It's heading toward the Cougar goal. But the Cougar goalie is standing there ready to make an easy catch. But from the left side of the field, Little Roger, one of the smallest players on the Buccaneer team, comes into the picture. He has left the ground. He is airborne. He intercepts that ball in midair before it gets to the Cougar goalie, and he flicks it with his head toward the goal. He flicked it at such an angle, the Cougar goalie had no chance at all. Whoosh! Into the back of the net it went. Now, for a few seconds, there was a stunned silence out on the field. I mean, the Buccaneers had not only scored a goal on the mighty Cougars, it was a magnificent goal. But It's only the opening minute of the game. A long way to go. And I could look at those Cougars. I looked at their faces. They now knew that the Buccaneers had come to play. So the game was restarted and the battle began in earnest. Back and forth they went. But each time the Cougars came down the field, there was a Buccaneer. Not always the same one, but a Buccaneer would appear and thwart that attack and send the ball back up the field. And before long, it was halftime. And the score stood. Buccaneers 1, Cougars 0. The boys came over, had their refreshments, and before heading back out for the second half, I reminded them, remember the story of that little seagull now. You never know what you can achieve, what you can accomplish, unless you keep trying. And sometimes you have to reach deep inside yourself. So the second half got underway. But now word had spread. The mighty Cougars were trailing in the second half to, of all teams, the Buccaneers. Arriving players and coaches and other spectators, they came down to our field to see what was going on. The Buccaneers had drawn a crowd. Back and forth they went. Each minute ticked by agonizingly slow. And with time I could tell the Buccaneers were growing tired. They were growing weary, but they were reaching deep. They grew more tired and more weary, and they reached even deeper. There was no more you could ask from this group of boys. They were playing their hearts out. But then it finally happened. 3 short blasts from the referee's whistle signaled the end of the game. In the biggest upset in the league that season, the Buccaneers had defeated the mighty Cougars on the margin of one thin goal scored in the opening minute of the game. Well, as you could guess, it was pandemonium. What a celebration. The little guys jumping up and down, hugging themselves, falling on the ground. I could only stand there in the midst of it all. It was my proudest moment. As I came back to the present, standing on that empty field where it all happened, I could still hear the echoes of that celebration in my head. And I got to thinking about those boys, Mike and Scott, Stephen, and yes, little Roger, and all the rest of them. They were all grown now, all scattered to the winds. Did the story of that little seagull make a difference that day? Who knows? What I do know is they had that moment to take with them on their life's journey. They had that moment to take with them as they each discovered their own way of taking flight